Dr. Sarah Chun had seen many things during her 3 years aboard the Interspecies Research Station Harmony Point, but nothing quite like the scene unfolding in the Xenobiology lab. The Kithrin delegation had arrived that morning with their most precious cargo, a clutch of predator cubs from their homeworld's apex species, the shadow moths. These weren't just any specimens. They were the offspring of the legendary pack leader Grimfong, whose bloodline had terrorized Kithrin settlements for over 2 centuries. The cubs were meant to be a gesture of trust, a symbol of the growing alliance between humanity and the reptilian Kithrin Empire. Sarah watched through reinforced transparisteel as the lead Kithrin scientist, High Researcher Vextar, carefully transported the containment pods into the specialized habitat they had prepared. Each cub was roughly the size of a large earth dog, but their sleek black scales and razor-sharp claws left no doubt about their lethal potential. Remember, Dr. Chun, Vextar's translator device rendered his hissing speech into crisp English. These are not domesticated creatures. Even as younglings, they possess killing instincts that have been refined over millions of years of evolution. My people have lost entire research teams to adult shadow moths. We approach them only with heavy protective gear and neural dampening fields. Sarah nodded respectfully, though something in the Kithrin's tone bothered her. It wasn't just caution she heard, but genuine fear. The Kithrins were themselves predators, standing nearly 8 feet tall, with natural armor plating and retractable claws that could slice through steel. Yet they spoke of these cubs like they were handling antimatter bombs. The habitat dome was impressive, a perfect recreation of the Kithrin Shadowlands complete with artificial moonlight and temperature controls. As the cubs were released from their pods, Sarah got her first close look at them. They moved with fluid grace, their oversized paws suggesting they would grow to enormous size. Their eyes were the most striking feature, deep amber orbs that seemed to analyze everything around them with disturbing intelligence. The neural dampening field is at maximum strength, announced Dr. Kelwick, the station's head of xenobiology. We should be perfectly safe for observation and basic interaction protocols. Sarah watched as the cubs explored their new environment. They moved as a pack, communicating through subtle body language and soft growling sounds. One of them, slightly smaller than the others with distinctive silver markings around its eyes, seemed more curious about the observation windows. It approached the transparisteel barrier and placed one paw against it, tilting its head as it studied the gathered scientists. "Fascinating," Sarah murmured, making notes on her tablet. Their pack coordination is already fully developed, even at this young age. And look at the way the silver-marked one is examining our equipment. That's problem-solving behavior. Vextar's mandibles clicked nervously. That one is the daughter of Grimfong herself. We have designated her Specimen 7. She has shown concerning levels of intelligence during transport. I recommend maintaining maximum distance protocols. But Sarah was already captivated. She had spent years studying predator behavior across dozens of species, from the crystal spiders of Arcturus Prime to the shadow wolves of Kepler 442b. There was something different about these cubs, something that went beyond simple predatory instinct. The way Specimen 7 watched the humans suggested not just intelligence, but genuine curiosity. Over the following days, Sarah found herself drawn repeatedly to the observation deck. She would arrive early before the other researchers and spend hours watching the cubs interact. They were learning the layout of their habitat with remarkable speed, finding hiding spots, and establishing territorial boundaries. But it was Specimen 7 who truly fascinated her. The small cub had taken to sitting near the observation window during Sarah's visits, almost as if she was studying the human as much as Sarah was studying her. When the other researchers arrived, Specimen 7 would retreat to the shadows, but during Sarah's solitary visits, she remained visible and alert. "You're developing quite an attachment," Dr. Kelwick observed during their weekly team meeting. "I've noticed you spending considerable time with the shadow moth specimens." "They're remarkable creatures," Sarah replied. "Their intelligence levels are off the charts. I think we're underestimating their cognitive abilities. Vextar, who had remained on the station to monitor the cubs, interrupted with agitation. Dr. Chun, you must understand the danger. These are not Earth mammals that can be domesticated or befriended. They're killing machines bred by evolution to hunt and destroy. The neural dampening field is the only thing preventing them from attempting to break through the containment barriers. Sarah wanted to argue, but she held her tongue. The Kitharans knew these creatures better than anyone. Still, something about Specimen 7's behavior suggested there was more to the story. The breakthrough came during her 4th week of observation. Sarah had arrived at the lab early, as had become her custom, carrying her usual cup of coffee and tablet full of behavioral notes. The lighting was dimmed to simulate the cubs' natural dawn period, and most of them were sleeping in a pile near the artificial cave structure. But Specimen 7 was awake, sitting by the observation window, as if waiting for her. Sarah settled into her chair and began her routine observations, noting feeding patterns and social hierarchies. As she wrote, she became aware that Specimen 7 had moved closer to the barrier, close enough that Sarah could see the intricate patterns in her scales and the intelligence gleaming in those amber eyes. Without thinking, Sarah raised her hand and placed it against the transparasteel, the same gesture the cub had made weeks earlier. Specimen 7 responded immediately, pressing her own paw against the barrier from the other side. For a moment, human and predator regarded each other through the transparent wall, separated by technology, but connected by something neither species fully understood. That's when the alarm began to sound. Containment breach in Lab 7. The station's AI announced in calm, measured tones that somehow made the situation more terrifying. All personnel evacuate immediately. Repeat, containment breach in Lab 7. Sarah's blood went cold. Lab 7 was the Shadow Maw habitat. She looked around frantically, trying to understand what had gone wrong. The transparasteel barrier was intact, the neural dampening field showed green status lights, and all the cubs appeared to be in their designated areas. But the alarms continued to blare, and she could hear running footsteps in the corridor outside. Dr. Kelwick burst through the observation deck doors, his face pale with panic. Sarah, get away from there. The neural dampening field is fluctuating. The cubs are becoming agitated. For the first time since the cubs had arrived, Sarah looked at them with fear. They were no longer the curious, almost playful creatures she had been studying. Their body language had changed completely. They moved with predatory grace, their eyes focused and hunting behavior activated. All except Specimen 7, who remained by the window, watching Sarah with what almost looked like concern. The field generators are overloading, Kelwick shouted over the alarms. Something is interfering with the neural dampeners. We need to evacuate the entire section before they break through. As if summoned by his words, Vextar appeared with a full security team of Kitharan warriors in combat armor. I warned you this would happen, he hissed. Human technology is insufficient to contain creatures of this caliber. We must implement emergency termination protocols before they escape. No. Sarah found herself shouting. They haven't done anything wrong. The containment is still holding. But even as she spoke, she could see cracks beginning to form in the transparasteel barrier. The cubs, driven by instincts older than civilization, had begun testing the walls of their prison. All except Specimen 7, who continued to sit by the window, her paw still pressed against the spot where Sarah's hand had been. The cracks in the transparasteel grew larger with each passing second. Soon, nothing would stand between the most dangerous predators in known space and the soft, vulnerable humans of Harmony Point Station. Sarah realized that everything she thought she knew about these creatures was about to be put to the ultimate test. The last thing she remembered before the lights went out was the sight of Specimen 7's amber eyes, watching her with an expression that defied every assumption about predator and prey that had ever been made. Emergency lighting bathed the laboratory in an eerie red glow as backup power systems struggled to maintain critical functions. Sarah found herself pressed against the far wall of the observation deck, her heart hammering against her ribs as she watched the shadow maw cubs emerge through the shattered transparisteel barrier. The neural dampening field had failed completely, leaving nothing between the apex predators and their prey except empty air. The Kithrin security team had taken defensive positions around the laboratory entrance, their plasma weapons humming with lethal energy. Vextar's mandibles clicked rapidly as he shouted orders in his native language, but Sarah could see the fear in his reptilian features. These were warriors who had faced down armies, yet they trembled before creatures that barely reached their knees. "Hold position," Vextar commanded, switching to the common tongue. "Do not fire unless they make aggressive movements. We need them alive if possible." But the cubs weren't behaving as anyone expected. Instead of immediately attacking or attempting to escape, they had formed a protective circle in the center of the laboratory, their pack instincts overriding their predatory drives. They growled and hissed at the Kithrins, but made no move to advance. All except Specimen 7, who had separated herself from a group and was slowly approaching the observation deck where Sarah stood frozen. "Dr. Chun," Dr. Kelwick whispered urgently from behind the security barricade. "Move slowly toward the exit. Don't make any sudden movements." But Sarah couldn't move. Specimen 7 was walking directly toward her with purpose, her amber eyes locked onto Sarah's face. Every instinct screamed at Sarah to run, but something deeper kept her feet planted. This was the same creature who had sat by the window for weeks, watching her with curiosity rather than hunger. The same cub who had pressed her paw against the barrier in what almost seemed like a gesture of communication. The young Shadow Maw reached the base of the observation platform and paused. At this distance, Sarah could see details that had been invisible through the transparisteel. The silver markings around Specimen 7's eyes formed intricate patterns that reminded Sarah of tribal tattoos. Her scales had an almost iridescent quality that shifted between deep black and midnight blue. But it was her size that truly shocked Sarah. In the weeks since arriving, the cub had grown considerably. She was now easily the size of a large wolf, with paws that suggested she would eventually dwarf even her Kithrin captors. "Fascinating," Sarah whispered, forgetting her fear as her scientific mind took over. "She's not showing any aggressive postures. Look at her body language. Ears forward, tail neutral, direct eye contact without dominance displays. This isn't predatory behavior." Vextar's translator crackled with static as he hissed a response. "Impossible. Shadow Maws do not exhibit curiosity toward potential prey. They kill or they ignore. There is no third option." But Specimen 7 was proving the Kithrin scientist wrong with every passing second. She had begun to circle the observation platform, not in the stalking pattern of a hunter, but in the cautious investigation of an intelligent creature exploring something new. Her nostrils flared as she analyzed scents, and her head tilted at various angles as she studied the human architecture. The other cubs remained in their defensive formation, but Sarah noticed they were watching their sister's actions with interest. Whatever Specimen 7 was learning, she was somehow communicating it to the pack through subtle body language and soft vocalizations that registered below human hearing. "She's teaching them," Sarah realized aloud. "She's showing the others that we're not a threat." "Dr. Chun, please step away from the platform," Dr. Kelwick urged. "You're anthropomorphizing their behavior. These are not domestic animals." But before Sarah could respond, the situation changed dramatically. Specimen 7 had completed her circuit of the observation deck and was now standing directly below Sarah. With a fluid motion that showcased her incredible physical capabilities, the cub leaped onto the platform in a single bound, landing silently just 3 meters away. The Kithrin weapons immediately swiveled toward the platform, energy cells whining as they charged to full power. But Vextar raised a clawed hand, stopping his warriors from firing. "Wait," he commanded. "She is not attacked. We observe." Sarah stood perfectly still as Specimen 7 approached her. At this distance, the cub size was overwhelming. Her head reached Sarah's chest, and her powerful muscles were clearly visible beneath her scaled hide. One swipe of those claws could disembowel a human in seconds. Yet when Specimen 7 extended her neck toward Sarah, it was with the careful curiosity of a creature seeking to understand rather than destroy. The cub's nostrils flared as she scented the air around Sarah. Her amber eyes moved from Sarah's face to her hands to the tablet she still clutched protectively. Then, in a gesture that defied every assumption about predator behavior, Specimen 7 lowered her head and gently bumped her snout against Sarah's arm. "Incredible," Sarah breathed. "She's initiating contact. This is unprecedented." The gentle touch emboldened Sarah to take a step forward. Specimen 7 didn't retreat or show any signs of aggression. Instead, she sat back on her haunches, bringing her eye level closer to Sarah's, and tilted her head in what could only be described as an inquisitive expression. Slowly, carefully, Sarah extended her hand palm up toward the cub. Specimen 7 sniffed the offered hand, then surprised everyone by pressing her snout into Sarah's palm and making a soft sound that was part purr, part growl. The texture of her scales was unlike anything Sarah had expected, warm and smooth, with a slight give that suggested living tissue rather than armor plating. "This changes everything," Sarah said, her voice filled with wonder. "She's not just intelligent. She's capable of forming interspecies bonds." Behind them, the other cubs had abandoned their defensive formation and were approaching the platform with cautious interest. If Specimen 7 trusted this human, their pack dynamics suggested they would follow her lead. But their approach triggered every alarm protocol in the Kithrin security team. "Multiple targets advancing," one of the warriors reported. "Permission to engage?" "Negative," Vextar replied, though his voice carried uncertainty. "The Alpha Cub has established peaceful contact. We maintain observation status." Sarah realized she had become the focal point of an unprecedented first contact situation. The decisions made in the next few minutes could determine the future relationship between humanity and one of the galaxy's most feared predator species. She could feel the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders as Specimen 7 continued to nuzzle her hand with surprising gentleness. The other cubs had reached the base of the platform and were making soft inquiry sounds toward their sister. Specimen 7 responded with a complex series of vocalizations that Sarah had never heard before. Not the growls and hisses of aggression, but something that resembled actual language. The cubs settled into sitting positions, watching Sarah with the same intelligent curiosity their leader had shown. "They're waiting for permission," Sarah realized. "She's telling them to wait for her signal." Dr. Kelwick's voice carried across the laboratory, tight with anxiety. "Sarah, we need to end this encounter before something goes wrong. These creatures are unpredictable." But Sarah was beginning to understand that the Shadow Maws were far from unpredictable. They operated according to complex social rules and demonstrated problem-solving abilities that rivaled the most intelligent Earth species. What the Kithrins had interpreted as savage bloodlust might actually be defensive behavior triggered by fear and misunderstanding. Specimen 7 had begun to explore Sarah's clothing and equipment with careful precision. Her claws, which could slice through steel, barely made contact with the fabric as she investigated pockets, seams, and textures. When she encountered the sleeve of Sarah's lab coat, her claw briefly snagged in the material. For a moment, every weapon in the laboratory swiveled toward them as the security teams prepared for the attack they were certain would follow. But instead of panic or aggression, Specimen 7 simply looked up at Sarah with what appeared to be an apologetic expression. Then, showing a level of dexterity that shouldn't have been possible with such large claws, she carefully worked to free herself without damaging the fabric. That's when Sarah smiled and gently tugged back on her sleeve, helping to free the caught claw. The simple gesture of cooperation seemed to electrify the young Shadow Maw. Her amber eyes widened, her ears perked forward, and She made a sound of pure delight that resonated through the laboratory like music. The other cubs immediately responded to their leader's joy with excited vocalizations of their own. They began to move up the platform, no longer cautious, but eager to investigate this strange new creature who had proven herself worthy of their sister's trust. Sarah found herself surrounded by apex predators who were treating her like a beloved pack member rather than potential prey. Alert! Alert! The station's AI announced with mechanical calm. Additional containment failures detected in Section C. Multiple hostile entities approaching Laboratory 7. Through the observation windows, Sarah could see new shapes moving in the corridors beyond. The facility's other xenobiological specimens had somehow escaped their containment as well, drawn by the commotion in the Shadow Maw habitat. Unlike the cubs, these creatures showed clear signs of aggression and hunger. Specimen 7's entire demeanor changed in an instant. Her playful curiosity vanished, replaced by the cold calculation of a born killer. She moved to place herself between Sarah and the approaching threats, her siblings forming a protective formation around them. For the first time since the containment breach began, the cubs were displaying the legendary ferocity their species was known for. But this time they weren't the hunters. They were the guardians. The laboratory's emergency lighting cast dancing shadows across the walls as the first wave of escaped specimens entered the chamber. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she recognized the creatures approaching through the shattered doorways. Corrosive slugs from the Andorian system oozed through air vents, their acidic bodies leaving smoking trails on the metal flooring. A pack of crystalline hunters from Rigel Prime skittered across the ceiling, their razor-sharp limbs clicking against the steel supports. Most terrifying of all, a shadow stalker from the void nebula materialized in the corner of the room, its form shifting between dimensions as it searched for prey. The Kithran security team immediately opened fire, but their plasma bolts seemed to have little effect on creatures specifically evolved to survive hostile environments. Vexstar's mandibles clicked in rapid distress as he shouted orders to his warriors, but even their advanced weaponry was proving inadequate against this diverse collection of galactic predators. Sarah found herself at the center of a protective formation unlike anything documented in xenobiological literature. The 5 Shadow Maw cubs had arranged themselves in a perfect defensive circle around her, with Specimen 7 taking point position toward the greatest threat. Their earlier playfulness had vanished completely, replaced by the cold efficiency of creatures born to kill. The transformation in the cubs was breathtaking and terrifying. Their scales had darkened to absorb light, making them nearly invisible in the emergency lighting. Their amber eyes had shifted to a predatory gold, and their claws had extended to full length. Most remarkably, they were communicating through a complex series of subsonic growls and body movements that coordinated their actions with military precision. "Impossible," Vextar whispered, his translator barely catching the words. Shadow Maw cubs do not reach tactical maturity for at least 2 standard years. They should not be capable of coordinated pack hunting. But the cubs were proving his assumptions wrong with deadly effectiveness. When the first corrosive slug approached their perimeter, 2 cubs flanked it with synchronized movements, while Specimen 7 created a distraction from the front. Their timing was perfect, allowing them to flip the creature onto its back and expose its vulnerable underside. The slug died instantly, its acidic blood safely contained by the cub's precise strike placement. Dr. Kelwick watched in amazement from behind the security barrier. They're not just protecting her randomly. Look at their formation patterns. They're treating Dr. Chun like a pack leader. Sarah could feel the truth of his words. Somehow, in the weeks of observation and the moment of first contact, she had been adopted into the cubs' social structure. They weren't just defending her out of curiosity or temporary alliance. They had accepted her as family, and Shadow Maws died for their family. The crystalline hunters presented a different challenge. Their multi-limbed bodies could attack from multiple angles simultaneously, and their hardened shells deflected the cubs' claws. But Specimen 7 had already analyzed their weakness. She led her siblings in a coordinated charge that knocked the hunters off balance, then used their own momentum to smash them against the laboratory's reinforced walls. The hunters' crystalline bodies shattered like glass, their fragments scattering across the floor in rainbow patterns. It was the Shadow Stalker that posed the real danger. The creature existed partially outside normal space, making it nearly immune to physical attacks. It flowed across the laboratory like living darkness, probing for weaknesses in the Cubs' defenses. Each time it solidified to attack, the Cubs struck back, but their claws passed through its shifting form without causing damage. The Stalker is adapting to their attack patterns, Sarah observed, her scientific mind still functioning despite the chaos around her. It's learning their defensive strategies faster than they can modify them. The Shadow Stalker had identified her as the weak point in the formation. It began to circle closer, testing the Cubs' reaction times and looking for an opening. When it finally struck, the attack came from directly overhead, dropping through a dimensional fold that bypassed the Cubs' perimeter entirely. Sarah threw herself backward as claws of solidified darkness slashed through the air where her head had been moments before. The Stalker landed between her and Specimen 7, cutting her off from her protectors. Its form solidified as it prepared for a killing strike, and Sarah found herself staring into alien eyes that held nothing but hunger. That's when something unexpected happened. Instead of cowering or fleeing, Sarah felt a surge of protective fury that surprised her with its intensity. These Cubs had risked their lives to defend her, had accepted her into their pack despite every biological imperative that should have marked her as prey. She would not let their sacrifice be wasted. "Get away from my Cubs," she shouted, grabbing a heavy equipment case and swinging it at the Stalker's head with all her strength. The case passed harmlessly through the creature's shadowy form, but her words and actions had an immediate effect on the Shadow Maw Cubs. Specimen 7's eyes blazed with golden fire as she heard Sarah claim them as her own. The young predator let out a roar that shook the entire laboratory, a sound of pure rage that spoke of bloodlines stretching back to the dawn of her species. The other Cubs responded to their sister's call with roars of their own, creating a harmonized war cry that made the station's hull vibrate. But more than just noise, their vocalizations were having a direct effect on the Shadow Stalker. The creature's form began to fluctuate wildly as the sonic pressure interfered with its dimensional phasing ability. "The roars are creating dimensional resonance," Dr. Kelwick shouted over the din. "They're forcing it into normal space." Trapped in solid form, the Shadow Stalker was vulnerable for the first time since the fight began. The Cubs didn't waste the opportunity. They struck as one, 5 sets of claws, finding their target with surgical precision. The Stalker dissolved into component shadows that quickly faded, its threat permanently ended. But the victory celebration was short-lived. More escaped specimens were entering the laboratory, drawn by the sounds of combat and the scent of spilled blood. Sarah could see movement in every doorway and access tunnel as the station's entire collection of dangerous life forms converged on their location. Vextar's security team was running low on ammunition, and their weapons were proving ineffective against creatures specifically chosen for their resistance to conventional attacks. The Kithran commander made a decision that would have been unthinkable hours earlier. "Dr. Chun," he called across the laboratory, "can you communicate with the Cubs? We need their help if we're going to survive this." Sarah looked down at Specimen 7, who was watching her with intelligent eyes that seemed to understand the gravity of their situation. The Cub had positioned herself close enough to touch, her powerful body trembling with the need for action while she waited for Sarah's direction. "They're waiting for orders," Sarah realized. "They've made me their pack leader, which means they won't act without my permission." The responsibility was overwhelming. These creatures could kill every hostile alien in the laboratory, but it would mean unleashing forces that had terrorized civilized space for millennia. Yet without their intervention, everyone in the facility would die anyway. Sarah placed her hand on Specimen 7's head, feeling the warmth of living scales and the power of muscles coiled for action. "Protect our pack," she whispered. The words seemed to unleash something primal in the cubs. They spread out through the laboratory like living weapons, each one targeting different threats with the precision of trained soldiers. But they weren't mindless killers. Sarah watched in amazement as they carefully avoided the Kitharan security team, recognizing them as allies rather than enemies. The battle that followed was unlike anything in recorded xenobiological history. The cubs moved through the escaped specimens like angels of death, their natural advantages amplified by coordinated tactics and absolute fearlessness. Acid spitters found themselves flanked before they could dissolve their targets. Armored crushers were systematically taken apart by claws that found every weak point in their natural armor. Psychic parasites discovered that Shadow Maw mines were completely immune to their mental invasions. But it was the way they protected the humans and Kitharans that truly amazed Sarah. Whenever a specimen broke through their primary defense lines, the cubs would intercept with perfect timing. They shepherded the research teams away from danger zones and created safe corridors for evacuation. They had transformed from specimens into guardians in the space of a single battle. Specimen 7 fought with particular fury, staying close to Sarah while engaging multiple threats simultaneously. Her movements were poetry written in violence, each strike precisely calculated for maximum effectiveness. When a pack of tunnel crawlers emerged from the ventilation system directly above Sarah, Specimen 7 leaped 8 feet straight up to intercept them in mid-air, dispatching all 3 before they could touch the ground. As the last of the hostile specimens fell to the cubs' coordinated assault, an eerie silence settled over the laboratory. Sarah looked around at the carnage with a mixture of awe and horror. The cubs had saved everyone in the facility, but they had also demonstrated why their species was feared across the galaxy. They were living weapons with intelligence to match their physical capabilities. Specimen 7 padded back to Sarah's side, her scales gradually lightening as she transitioned from combat mode to her normal coloration. She nuzzled Sarah's hand with the same gentle affection she had shown earlier, as if the intervening battle had been nothing more than an afternoon's exercise. "Alert! Alert!" the station's AI announced. "Emergency response teams have arrived. All personnel remain in position for debriefing and medical evaluation." Through the observation windows, Sarah could see Galactic Defense Force shuttles docking with the station. Within minutes, the laboratory would be swarming with troops and scientists, all demanding answers about the unprecedented events they had witnessed. But for now, Sarah stood surrounded by 5 of the most dangerous predators in known space, each one looking at her with expressions of loyalty and affection that defied every assumption about their species. She had become the first human to earn the protection of Shadow Maws, and somehow she suspected this was only the beginning of a much larger story. 3 months after the incident at Harmony Point Station, Sarah stood before the Galactic Council Assembly on Proxima Centauri, facing representatives from over 200 star systems. The magnificent chamber stretched beyond the horizon, its crystalline walls amplifying the voices of delegates, whose species ranged from energy beings of pure thought to silicon-based hive minds that communicated through controlled electromagnetic pulses. At her side, maintaining perfect military posture despite her youth, sat Specimen 7, now officially designated as Ambassador Shadow Dancer at her own request. The events at Harmony Point had sent shockwaves through the galactic community. For the first time in recorded history, humanity had demonstrated the ability to form symbiotic relationships with apex predators from outside their own evolutionary tree. The implications were staggering, and not everyone was pleased with the development. "The human delegation will present their findings," announced Chancellor Vorthak, a crystalline being whose voice resonated through harmonic frequencies that translated into dozens of languages simultaneously. "Dr. Sarah Chun, you have claimed to establish meaningful communication with the Shadow Maw specimens. The Council requires proof of these allegations." Sarah stepped forward, her hand resting lightly on Shadow Danesur's neck. The young Shadow Maw had grown considerably in the months since the station incident, now standing nearly 4 feet at the shoulder with a grace and intelligence that captivated everyone who met her. Her scales had developed intricate patterns that seemed to shift depending on her mood, currently displaying the deep blue of calm confidence. "Honorable delegates," Sarah began, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber's acoustic systems. "I present to you not a specimen, but an individual. Shadow Danesur is not merely intelligent. She is sapient. She possesses self-awareness, emotional complexity, and the ability to form abstract concepts about justice and morality." A ripple of skeptical murmurs swept through the assembly. The Kithrin delegation, led by High Researcher Vextar, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They had spent generations studying shadow maws as dangerous beasts, and the revelation that they might actually be a sentient species carried uncomfortable implications about their past research methods. "Demonstrate this supposed intelligence," challenged Ambassador Zathara from the Rigelian hegemony. "Show us proof that this creature is more than an advanced predator responding to conditioned stimuli." Sarah smiled and looked down at Shadow Danesur, who had been following the proceedings with obvious interest. "Shadow Danesur, would you like to speak for yourself?" The young Shadow Maw rose to her feet and approached the central speaking platform. Her movements were fluid and purposeful, showing none of the hesitation that might be expected from an animal in an unfamiliar environment. When she reached the designated spot, she turned to face the assembled delegates and began to speak. The sounds that emerged from her throat were unlike anything the council had heard before. They were clearly vocalizations rather than random animal sounds, with recognizable patterns of rhythm and tone that suggested sophisticated language structure. But more remarkable was the translation device that Sarah had developed, which rendered Shadow Danesur's words into the common galactic tongue in real time. "Honored beings of many worlds," Shadow Danesur's translated voice resonated through the chamber. "I stand before you not as a specimen or curiosity, but as a representative of my people. For too long, we have been misunderstood, labeled as mindless killers when in truth we are protectors of our families and our territories. My pack sister Sarah has shown me that communication across species is possible, and through her, I hope to build bridges between our peoples." The reaction was immediate and dramatic. Half the delegates erupted in excited discussion, while the other half sat in stunned silence. Never before had a non-spacefaring species addressed the Galactic Council directly. The implications were staggering, not just for human-shadow maw relations, but for every interaction between advanced civilizations and supposedly primitive species. Representative Cole Varon of the Andromedan Trade Federation leaned forward with obvious skepticism. "This could easily be an elaborate deception. How do we know these vocalizations actually originate from the creature's own consciousness rather than sophisticated programming?" Shadow Danesur's response surprised everyone. "You speak of deception while your own people trade in slaves taken from worlds you classify as pre-sapient," she said, her tone carrying a note of cold anger. "I have studied the records that Sarah showed me. Your trade goods include thinking beings whose only crime was lacking faster-than-light travel. Perhaps you should examine your own practices before questioning my authenticity." The Andromedan delegation recoiled as if physically struck. The accusation was not only accurate, but demonstrated knowledge of galactic politics that no programmed response could have generated. Shadow Danesur had clearly studied the Council's history and formed her own moral judgments about their actions. Chancellor Vorthak's crystalline form pulsed with interest. "The creature speaks of studying records. Are you claiming that shadow maws possess the cognitive ability to understand abstract concepts like interstellar politics and ethical philosophy?" "I am claiming much more than that," Sarah interjected, stepping forward to stand beside her friend. "Shadow Danesur and her siblings have demonstrated capabilities that surpass many recognized sapient species. They have developed new hunting techniques based on observed human military tactics. They have created art forms that combine their natural vocalizations with movement patterns that tell complex stories. Most remarkably, they have established diplomatic protocols for interacting with other species based on principles of mutual respect and benefit. To demonstrate her point, Sarah activated a holographic display that showed the cubs interacting with various species aboard the research station. The recordings revealed behaviors that went far beyond simple intelligence. The Shadow Maws were seen sharing food with injured Kithran researchers, providing physical assistance to elderly human scientists, and even engaging in what could only be described as philosophical discussions about the nature of consciousness with the station's artificial intelligence. They have also, Sarah continued, demonstrated technological aptitude that suggests their species could achieve spaceflight within a generation if given access to appropriate resources. Shadow Dancer has already designed improvements to our containment systems that would prevent future breaches while maintaining ethical standards for scientific research. The presentation continued for over an hour, with Sarah and Shadow Dancer providing evidence of cognitive abilities, emotional depth, and moral reasoning that met or exceeded the criteria for sapient recognition. The young Shadow Maw answered questions from the delegates with thoughtfulness and dignity, occasionally displaying flashes of humor that delighted the assembled representatives. But it was the final exchange that sealed the outcome. Elder statesman Quexthal from the ancient Concordat, widely respected as the wisest being in the galaxy, asked a simple question that cut to the heart of the matter. "Young Shadow Dancer," he said in his ancient, creaking voice, "why do you seek recognition from this council? What do you hope to gain from our acknowledgement?" Shadow Dancer's response was immediate and heartfelt. "I seek recognition not for myself, but for my people. For generations, we have been hunted and feared because others did not understand us. My pack sister Sarah showed me that understanding is possible, that different species can work together for mutual benefit rather than mutual destruction. I want my children and their children to grow up in a galaxy where they are judged by their actions rather than their appearance, where they can contribute to the greater community rather than being forced to hide in shadows." The silence that followed was profound. Even the most skeptical delegates seemed moved by the sincerity and nobility of her words. When Chancellor Vorthak called for a vote on Shadow Maw sapience recognition, the result was unanimous approval. The formal ceremonies that followed were groundbreaking in galactic history. Shadow Dancer was officially recognized as the first Shadow Maw ambassador to the Galactic Council, with full diplomatic status and protection. Trade agreements were established that would allow her people to exchange their unique biological insights for technology and education. Most importantly, hunting restrictions were implemented that classified any hostile action against Shadow Maws as crimes against sapient beings. But for Sarah, the most meaningful moment came after the official proceedings ended. She and Shadow Dancer stood on the observation deck of the council chamber, looking out at the stars that now represented opportunities rather than barriers. "I never imagined this would happen when I first saw you press your paw against that barrier," Sarah said, stroking the soft scales behind Shadow Dancer's ears. The young Shadow Maw made a sound that the translator rendered as laughter. "I knew from that first moment that you were different, Pack Sister. You looked at me and saw a person rather than a monster. That made all the difference." As if summoned by their conversation, Shadow Dancer's 4 siblings emerged from the diplomatic quarters where they had been staying. They had all grown during their time away from Kithra Prime, developing into magnificent examples of their species. But more importantly, they had all learned to communicate using the translation devices Sarah had developed, each one bringing their own personality and perspective to the expanding dialogue between species. "The others are ready to return home," Shadow Dancer reported. "They want to share what they have learned with the rest of our people to begin preparing them for membership in the galactic community." Sarah felt a pang of sadness at the thought of saying goodbye, but she understood the necessity. The Shadow Maws needed to rejoin their people and begin the process of cultural integration that would transform their entire species. It would take time, perhaps decades, but eventually shadow maw colonies might spread across the galaxy, bringing their unique perspectives and abilities to countless worlds. Will you come with us? Shadow Danesir asked, her amber eyes bright with hope. My people would be honored to welcome the human who first spoke for us. You could help establish the communication protocols that will allow others to follow your example. Sarah considered the offer seriously. Her career at the research station was effectively over, her work complete in ways she had never anticipated. The opportunity to become humanity's first ambassador to a species they had helped elevate to spacefaring status was tempting beyond measure. Yes, she decided, surprising herself with the speed of her answer. I think I would like that very much. As their transport ship prepared for departure, Sarah took one last look at the Galactic Council headquarters. She had arrived as a xenobiologist studying dangerous predators. She was leaving as a diplomat representing a new alliance between species that had found common ground despite their vast differences. Shadow Danesir settled beside her on the observation couch, her warm presence a comfort as they prepared for the journey to her homeworld. Thank you, Pack Sister, she said softly, for seeing us as we truly are. Sarah smiled and scratched behind the young ambassador's ears, marveling at how a simple moment of curiosity had changed the course of galactic history. Thank you for showing me that predator and prey are just roles we play, not who we truly are. As their ship entered hyperspace, carrying them toward a world where shadow maws roamed free under alien stars, Sarah realized that her greatest discovery wasn't about predator behavior or interspecies communication. It was about the fundamental truth that intelligence and compassion could bridge any gap, no matter how vast the differences between species might seem. In a galaxy full of wonders and terrors, the greatest miracle of all was the simple act of reaching across the void to say, I understand you, and you understand me. The predator cub who had once snagged her sleeve with accidental claws had become the bridge to a future where humanity's greatest strength wasn't their technology or their weapons, but their ability to see potential friends in the most unlikely places.